All right, we're live in 3, 2, 1. You're tuned to Rust 88.8.
It's 1982. A man in Surrey, England, is renovating his chimney. He's pulling out decades of debris, dust, old bricks, the usual mess. And then bones start falling out, one by one, and then a leg, with a small red canister attached to it. Inside that canister, a handwritten note, 27 groups of 5 letters, completely unreadable. He hands it to the authorities. The authorities hand it to Britain's top intelligence agency. The same people descended from the legendary codebreakers of World War II. They look at it for weeks, and then they do something nobody expected. They give up. Because what this man pulled out of his chimney wasn't just a dead bird. It was a secret message from the most important day in modern history, and nobody on earth knows what it says. David Martin wasn't looking for history when he started clearing out his chimney in Bletchley, Surrey. He was just doing home renovations, but as he pulled debris down from inside the flue, pigeon bones began appearing one by one, and attached to the leg of what turned out to be a long-dead carrier pigeon was something that would baffle experts for decades: a small red canister, still sealed after nearly 40 years. Inside was a message, handwritten on an official World War II pigeon service form. At the top, the words "Pigeon Service." Below that, 27 blocks of 5 letters each, seemingly random, completely encrypted. It was addressed to someone called XO2, and it was signed by a SJTW Stott, believed to be Sergeant William Stott. The date on the form pointed to June 6th, 1944, D-Day, the single most important day of the Second World War. The day 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest seaborne invasion in history. The day the tide of the war turned, and somewhere in the chaos of that day, a British sergeant attached a message to a pigeon and sent it home. That pigeon never made it. Instead, it died inside a chimney in Surrey, and its message waited 38 years for someone to find it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what carrier pigeons meant in World War II. Over 250,000 pigeons served in the war. They weren't a backup plan. They were critical infrastructure, flying at speeds of up to 52 miles per hour, covering distances of up to 620 miles. These birds carried messages that radios couldn't transmit safely. In the chaos of battle, in the noise and smoke and radio silence of an invasion, a pigeon was sometimes the only reliable way to get word back to headquarters. Each bird was registered with the National Union of Racing Pigeons and given an individual identity number. They were trained, monitored, and protected like military assets. The Germans took them so seriously that Himmler himself oversaw Germany's own pigeon program. The Gestapo ran their pigeon federation. In 1937, before the war even began, Germany brought 1,400 pigeons to England under the cover of a racing competition. Intelligence agencies later suspected it was actually a training exercise to prepare the birds to cross the English Channel when war came. Britain was so worried about enemy pigeons carrying intelligence back to Germany that in 1942 they established a falconry unit on the Isle of Scilly, specifically to intercept them mid-flight. The falcons, unfortunately, couldn't tell friend from foe. Many British pigeons were lost in the effort. This was the world Sergeant Stott was operating in on June 6, 1944. Somewhere behind enemy lines or on the beaches of Normandy, he wrote something down. Something important enough to encrypt. Something he needed headquarters to know. He attached it to a pigeon, released it into the sky, and trusted it to fly home. It didn't make it. When David Martin's discovery reached British authorities, it eventually made its way to GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, Britain's elite signals intelligence agency. the direct successor to the legendary Bletchley Park codebreakers who cracked the Nazi Enigma machine during the war. These are the people who have spent decades breaking the unbreakable. They looked at Sergeant Stott's message for weeks, and then they made a public announcement that sent chills through the history community. They couldn't crack it. Their statement was almost uncomfortable in its honesty. Without access to the original codebooks, details of any additional encryption, or any context around the message, it will be impossible to decode. The reason comes down to how wartime messages were encrypted. Soldiers in the field didn't use a single universal code. They used individual codebooks, small specific references that assigned meaning to each letter group. The key that unlocks this message isn't hidden somewhere in a computer or buried in an archive. It was almost certainly destroyed. Standard wartime protocol. When the mission ended, the codebook burned. Some cryptographers believe the message may use something called a one-time pad, considered by mathematicians to be the only truly unbreakable cipher ever invented. If a message is encrypted with a one-time pad, and the pad itself no longer exists, the message is not just difficult to decode. It is impossible. Mathematically, provably impossible. The secret Sergeant Stott sent home on June 6, 1944 may never be known, but that hasn't stopped people from trying. In 2012, when the story became public, amateur codebreakers around the world attempted to solve what GCHQ could not. The most famous attempt came from a Canadian man named Gord Young, a local history enthusiast from Peterborough, Ontario. He claimed to have cracked it in just 17 minutes, using a World War I Royal Flying Corps codebook he inherited from his great-uncle. According to Young, the message reads something like, "Artillery observer at K Sector, Normandy. Panzer attack. Counter measures not working." He identified the sender as 27-year-old Sergeant William Stott of the Lancashire Fusiliers, who carried out reconnaissance work in Normandy and died just weeks after D-Day. It's a compelling solution, emotional even. A young soldier reporting on a desperate situation, killed shortly after, his final message unread until 70 years later. But GCHQ wasn't convinced. Military intelligence experts examined Young's work and concluded it was, in their words, deeply flawed, pointing out that he had misread letters, added characters that weren't there, and used a codebook from a completely different war. One expert called it, bluntly, absolute rot. GCHQ stood by their original position. The message remains officially undecoded. Then there's a third possibility that nobody talks about much. What if the message isn't military intelligence at all? The form indicates that 2 copies of the message were sent. Both Pigeons were deployed. Why send 2 copies of a critical battlefield report? Standard protocol would suggest the information was time-sensitive but not necessarily mission-critical. Some historians have quietly suggested the message may be more mundane. A routine status report, a position update, the kind of administrative communication that happens constantly during a military operation and means almost nothing outside its original context. Which raises a strange question. What if the reason nobody can read it isn't because it contains something extraordinary, but because it contains something completely ordinary that simply no longer has any context to give it meaning? A pigeon dies in a chimney in Surrey. It waits 38 years to be found. Britain's top codebreakers spend weeks on the message inside and walk away defeated. A Canadian man cracks it in 17 minutes with a World War I codebook, or thinks he does, and somewhere in a grave in Normandy, a 27-year-old soldier named William Stott is buried, a man who may have written these exact words, a man who never knew his message, never arrived. 3 possibilities sit in front of you. 1. The message contains genuine D-Day intelligence that is now permanently and mathematically lost to history. 2. A Canadian amateur actually solved what Britain's finest couldn't, and the answer was always hiding in a World War I codebook. 3. The message is entirely routine, a status report that would have been forgotten the same day it was written if the pigeon had ever made it home. Which one do you believe? Leave it in the comments, because 80 years later, nobody actually knows, and that is stranger than fiction.
Next time on Rust 88.8 FM, 2 girls, 1 choice. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it.